Welcome to the Roetzel HealthLaw HotSpot. HealthLaw HotSpot is a podcast for physicians and health professionals that covers the legal issues and trends that affect the healthcare industry.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the HealthLaw HotSpot. I'm Ericka Adler, shareholder and head of the HealthLaw Group at Roetzel and Andrus. Today, we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic and one that many of our clients ask us about all the time, which is, what is malpractice insurance? All those questions that you always wondered and never knew the answers to, we hope to get for you today. We have a great guest. Mike Maday is with us from the Horton Group. He has been involved with malpractice insurance there since 1994. He handles malpractice insurance with not only provider groups, but hospitals as well. And he really tries to bring that kind of value-added service, talking about safety, consulting, claims advocacy, and legal assistance. And we know from working with him that he's a really great source of getting questions answered. So we hope that we can answer some of those questions that you've always wondered about, or maybe ones of which you've not been aware. We also have, of course, my favorite shareholder and member of the HealthLaw Group at Roetzel and Andrus, also partner in charge of our Chicago office, David Hochman, joining us today. And let's just go ahead and get started. So why don't we start, Mike, with you just telling us a little bit about maybe, some of the work that you do with physicians and providers. We're really going to talk more about that side of things today in terms of malpractice insurance and maybe what you think is one of the biggest misconceptions out there that your clients seem to believe is true.
Sure. Ericka, David, thanks for having me on. I look forward to the discussion. I think one of the things that we do maybe just a little differently, not only with the malpractice insurance, we try to look at the practice from a holistic basis. There's other things besides the malpractice. I know we're going to concentrate on that today, but physician groups historically struggle with health benefits. They struggle with coverages that are outside the malpractice. We have a growing concern on cyber liability, which is becoming extremely important in the healthcare sector. But I do think that one of the things that physicians incorrectly assume is that my malpractice coverage covers me for everything. And some of the big areas that we run into, like our most frequent questions that we get are, of course, contractual risk transfer, which I think we're going to touch on later. And professional liability is not always so easy to work into any type of indemnification or contractual agreement. Another area that we run into is that I sit on the board or I'm a medical director for a non-owned facility. I have coverage under my malpractice policy. Not always the case. What about being
a medical director? Is that covered?
Yeah, if you're a medical director of your own practice, that's fine. But if I'm going to be the medical director of a nursing home, let's say that I have no financial interest in, or the group has no financial interest in, typically that coverage is going to be found under the nursing home policy.
What about things like expert witness testimony, being an expert witness? Is that something that would be under your policy, or you need separate coverage for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We typically get that there is coverage you can buy for that, actually. When you look at what does my policy provide for, the malpractice policy really provides for bodily injury, right? I mean, that's going to be our main exposure. If I'm an expert witness, I'm giving expert testimony. It has really nothing to do with bodily injury. So where do you find the remedy, right? So sometimes the carriers will kind of work with it a little bit, but again, I think that's a really good question. If you're going to enter into that type of agreement, it'd probably be good to have a discussion with your broker.
Right. I think that's something that people kind of misunderstand. They assume, clinical services require them to get some outside coverage, but they don't really wonder about the consulting and the expert witness type stuff. So when we talk about what is covered, though, I mean, doctors get sued. You mentioned cyber liability. They get sued for a lot of things. I assume that we're really just talking negligence here, like a patient gets hurt, a patient files a claim. That's what malpractice is covering. Is there anything beyond that that's in the standard malpractice policy or that has been added on in more recent years? Or what kinds of add-ons are people really needing to be looking at?
Yeah, there are. And again, as you can imagine, it's evolved. And when one carrier adds something, the other carriers all add it. So we wind up with a standard policy after everybody starts catching up with each other. So, there's coverage for responding to professional development claims. There's coverage typically built in now for cyber claims. However, these are not true coverages. These are either sublimited coverages or they're coverages that are kind of thrown in. When you're getting something for free, you're getting something for free for a reason, right? So there's always a, for example, on the cyber, which is on everybody's radar right now. All of the carriers have a cyber component. What a lot of people don't know is that they're giving you this base cyber. You can always go back to the carrier and buy a fuller form, which really gets close to mimicking what you would buy out in the marketplace. But again, that's something that everybody really needs to understand, that, hey, just because somebody threw in cyber coverage and I've got a sublimit of $50,000 for cyber, well, I'm sure both of you guys have been involved in it. 50,000 goes like that in the cyber world.
Right.
So again, just be cautious when somebody gives you something, right? I mean,
right. Well, what about things like audits by payors or sexual harassment claims, HIPAA? I mean, are any of those things those are things every practice should kind of have coverage for, but are they being rolled up in that standard malpractice, or do people think they have it when they don't? I mean, I guess
sometimes you'll find defense in there. Let's talk about sexual harassment. Are we talking sexual harassment of an employee? Are we talking about sexual harassment of a patient? Is it abuse of the patient? Is it sexual harassment, right? So we have a fine line there of what's the definition of what we're looking to get at. So if it is sexual abuse of a patient, a lot of times you'll find defense coverage. But when we look at that, right, that's a criminal action. It starts to get to be criminal, right? So once it turns into a criminal action, there's nothing left for the malpractice policy to do. On the sexual harassment side, that's employment practices liability. Again,
so abuse, like anything criminal, is going to be excluded. What about, and I think some of our clients, David, have had coverage where they get an audit being performed, and I don't know where this coverage is coming from. Is that a separate policy, or is that kind of built into malpractice? I'm really talking about like a payor audit.
That would be something that is not covered by a malpractice policy, right? Again, we go back to the genesis of the policy and the intent of the policy to cover bodily injury. Right. So a payer audit kind of outside the scope. Now, could you possibly find some little sublimit in there somewhere? Possibly somewhere, some policy.
Mike, this all illustrates why you could call up a malpractice insurance company directly and get coverage. I think that what you've been talking about explains why do you use a broker? Because a medical practices or a dental practice insurance needs are not just malpractice. There's a variety of other areas covered.
Right.
The one thing I've seen that I guess has been more prevalent in other professions, but I think as far as medicine, been more recent, is the ability to buy tail is something other than unlimited in duration. And are you seeing a lot of your clients that are opting to buy tails that have a period of only 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or most people still continuing the unlimited tail?
Yeah, it is out there, and it's a dangerous, it's a very dangerous slope and a slippery slope, right? Because when we talk about, there's a couple different things, and a lot of times the doctors will say, well, the statute's 2 years. I said, well, okay, but when's the statute run? You know, I mean, there's always a period of latency. If we're talking about a failure to diagnose claim, and, you know, the statute may not start to run for 2 or 3 years until we develop and we find out that there's a claim. Now I've got 2 years beyond that. What if I deal with a minor? The statute doesn't start to run until a minor reaches the age of majority, 18 here in Illinois. And then I've got 2 years beyond that. So again, I'd be very cautious of anybody. Matter of fact, I don't know if we would sell. I don't think we have to date sold anybody a tail that's less than a lifetime tail. It's just not worth it to save the few bucks.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
Yeah. So I mean, we've had some of our clients, doctors have left, and they have wanted to buy a tail with a shorter duration because of the cost. And our goal is to have in the employment agreements have language that specifies this is what the tail has to provide. It has to provide coverage until the statute of limitations bars the claim.
Right.
They have to have annual renewable limits.
I tell you, David, I think for us, we always talk to our groups and we just tell them, hey, really get into your employment agreement, because that's going to set the tone, right? So everybody goes into I'm coming onto the practice and it's a new relationship and, oh, these people are great and I love everybody. Well, when you exit, it's kind of like exiting a marriage, right? I mean, not many amicable divorces. This is just not there, right? So that employment agreement is going to be the governing document. It's going to say, do I have to buy tail? Does the group have to buy tail? Is there a combination or shared limit? What carrier do I have to buy tail from? It may even be so specific to say that you've got to buy tail from the carrier that we're currently with.
Right.
So that whole agreement there and crafting that agreement and going into the agreement, looking at the exit, that falls back on a good attorney, right? That's really why they should work with somebody like you guys.
Well, just to back up a little bit for anybody listening that's not familiar with what a tail is, there are two types of insurance. So the claims made policy is the one that requires a tail, and that's a constant battle. Who's going to pay for it? As David mentioned, the length of time. I think until recently, I really was not seeing language about a 2-year duration, et cetera. I had a client yesterday and their contract said the employer would buy it, but only a 2-year duration. And I said, no, I mean, that's really not enough. And they were told, well, that's all that's sold in our specialty. And that's simply just not true.
No.
So I think, doctors need to understand the truth about insurance. But I'm also seeing, the idea is that, claims made is a little bit less expensive. And then the tail is something that either somebody has to get at the end, unless you're continuing the policy or maybe getting a nose policy with a new employer. But I am seeing a trend towards employers wanting to maybe get occurrence coverage, even though it costs a little bit more. Are you seeing that trend? Are we seeing the cost of occurrence come down at all? And, what do you like to recommend? Is it really just not plausible that most groups could afford that?
Well, occurrence policy is definitely, from a mechanical standpoint, a lot easier. It's easier to understand. There's a lot more freedom. The problem you have going from with an occurrence form is that almost the whole marketplace here in Illinois anyway is on claims made. And how do I go from claims made to occurrence, right? There's a big cost for doing that. So because somebody's got to fund the tail on that claims made form when I switch. So somewhere along the lines, the money is going to float either to the insurance company or you keep it and wait until people exit. So it's a discussion. What we are seeing a lot more of are hybrid policies where we may have a group that's on a claims made form and we start bringing on new doctors on an occurrence form. That we're seeing little trends like that. But
I've seen like some doctors working out or groups working out a deal where somehow they're over time transitioning from a claims made to an occurrence. So it's making it a little easier for them. And then they end up with occurrence, which is ideal. Are you seeing that as well? Yes.
Yeah, it's a conversion policy. And what you do is in the interim, you kind of finance that tail over a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, right? So again, you're paying for it. So you really got to do a detailed cash flow analysis to say, does this make sense or doesn't it?
It's just so hard when you're looking at a young doctor and the doctor is going somewhere and they see in their contract that they leave that entire responsibilities on them. I mean, it can be a tremendous amount. I wish, and some contracts are just silent on it. And they just kind of put it out there. And nobody seems to actually have that legal responsibility, which is just as much a concern. Do you see people going bare at all, or is that just kind of unheard of?
Yeah, we don't really see too many people going bare. I'm sure it happens. We don't see a lot of it, though. I think a lot of people may talk about it, and I think a doctor may fantasize about it and just say, I'm just going to go bare and forget about it. And they had that conversation with themselves, but at some point in time, they either talk with their attorney or they talk with somebody and just goes, "Hey, doc, I understand where you're coming from. This is really important. You can't do it."
Right. I wish they made it more affordable. Like if you could, it always seems to have to be paid and the doctor just has to come up with that money. Like there's never like a payment plan where you could like take care of it over 2 years or something,
Yeah. Some of the carriers actually have a payment plan where you can do it over 2 or 3 years. But when you do go out into the open market, you're right, Ericka, it's a big chunk of change to throw down and nobody wants to finance it either for you. So it's definitely cumbersome.
I think the other thing you mentioned earlier we were going to talk about is the exclusion from coverage in these policies for contractual liability, contractual indemnity rather.
Yeah.
Where in a hospital contract or a practice contract, the physician is obligated to hold his employer or hold the hospital harmless from any claims arising out of the physician's negligence. And the problem is that is an exclusion, I think, in every malpractice policy that's written, at least in the state of Illinois.
Yeah, there are certain circumstances, and again, right, as with every absolute, right, there's always well, hang on, I saw it once, and then everybody says, "Oh, we can do it because I saw it once." There's an exception to every rule, but you're exactly right, David. The norm is that you cannot transfer professional liability indemnification. You just in the industry, you can't do it. And there'd have to be some extraordinary circumstance where a carrier may allow it. Right. But that's something that everybody should fight to eliminate from their contract.
But I think the problem is doctors don't appreciate that's carved out of their policy. Right. And so they say, "Oh, well, what's the big deal? I have insurance for it." Yeah,
you're exactly right.
In fact, they don't.
Yeah, I think, just to kind of, I don't want to call it dumbing it down, but just so everybody knows what you're talking about, in many contracts, there's a provision that says, I indemnify you if a claim is brought against you for my negligence, any losses, claims, anything like that. And so that's a negligence. And what we're saying is that in the malpractice policy, it literally, and I've seen the language, it literally says that this is voided if you pretty much make a promise to a third party to indemnify them for your negligence. So when I talk to my docs, I say, "Oh, this indemnification provision, it's not okay." And I very often have an argument with the lawyer on the other side. I'm like, "Look, we're not saying we won't indemnify you, but we're saying you have to look to insurance first." So there is a solution, but I think part of the problem, David, is we might recognize it, but the lawyers on the other side often fight about it. They don't understand the issue. And sometimes they're unwilling to change the language. And, unfortunately, if you're representing a physician joining a hospital or a group, they don't often have that bargaining power to change the language. And there are tons of contracts out there where doctors have signed those indemnification provisions. And I mean, I haven't necessarily seen a bad outcome because of that. So it's really hard to argue about why it's so important. But, as lawyers, technically, we don't like, those kind of mistakes being made. Right. Have you seen a contract be voided for this reason ever?
If you're asking me, I have not. But again, it's one of those things that just creates unnecessary angst, right?
Right.
And typically where we find it is, and unfortunately, doctors sign the agreements before they either consult their counsel or their broker. So we really, really try to have our clients get into a contractual review process. And at a minimum, send us the indemnification language. Let us take a look at it. I'm not really concerned with the business part of the contract, but that indemnification part, we really want to counsel just so you're walking into something with your eyes wide open.
I think there are a lot of people who do not know that this is a problem. I was talking to a hospital counsel, and I say, we want to take this indemnity provision out of the contract. And I apparently was the first person who would ever ask for that, because the hospital system's policy is we want to be indemnified against liability for the doctor's negligence.
Right. I think getting it out is not possible. I always just focus on saying, to the extent, insurance first. But in terms of people calling and asking you questions, I think that's a good thing you bring up. I mean, how accessible or how often, should clients be covering you? I mean, calling you? Obviously, if they need coverage, they call you, but what kind of questions should they be calling to ask you about? I mean, an indemnification provision in their contract, but if somebody makes a threat against them, for example, they're unhappy with something that happened and you better pay me this or I'm going to be filing a lawsuit. Like, are those the kind of questions that, I get those calls all the time from my clients saying, what do we do? And is that something they should call you about?
Absolutely. Yeah. If they don't have, again, if they don't have counsel to call, Ericka, if they've got a relationship with good counsel, you're probably the right place to go. Mm-hmm. But absent of that, yeah, absolutely. Calling us if there's a bad outcome, if they do get that letter in the mail, right? I mean, right. I want this and it's from somebody and they're not represented. But how do I navigate that whole process? And
I think I hate to give advice that could affect a policy. So somebody says, a patient complained about this and they want their money back and they want me to pay the doctor bills that they had to incur to go see someone. I'm like, I feel like I shouldn't be making that call, because if they give the money to someone or they sign something saying, hey, we're giving you this and you agree not to sue us. I mean, to me, I don't want to create an issue under their malpractice policy, exactly. Right? So I guess that's the kind of thing I usually would give. I always have an opinion on everything, of course, but would want them to check with their carrier first to make sure we're not stepping on anyone's toes, right?
Yeah, no, you're giving exactly the right advice. Absent that advice, right? People operate in their own environment. They say, well, you know what? I'm going to give this guy $500 and make him go away. And now all of a sudden we got a problem.
Right. I don't know that paying them means they can't still sue you. That's the thing, right?
Absolutely, it doesn't.
Right. And a lot of clients, just because you sign something saying I accept this and I won't sue you, doesn't mean they're still not going to, which is why kind of like, are they really bluffing? Are they going to hire a lawyer and sue? Or, you don't know, right?
Sure.
It's a concern. David, you've had that happen, right?
Yes. I mean, it happens, it's a patient has a dental injury. Right. And so now the question is, I want X dollars to get it repaired. And sometimes the problem is the patient really wants to have all their dental work that needs to be done taken care of. That's a negotiation position, but it's always a problem. You go and make the payment and get a release because you run the risk. Are you going to do something that's going to jeopardize the carrier's obligation to defend you under the policy? Mm-hmm. So it's better to be, a call to a lawyer, call to the broker, call to the insurance carrier is certainly worthwhile before you go and make that payment, before you make a decision on how to proceed.
Right. I agree.
Mike, I guess, there's, people, think insurance companies, they're always going to be around. There's never going to be a problem of solvency. And I've had situations where clients have had malpractice insurance and the carrier has become insolvent. And the last case I had was one where the carrier was still solvent, but they only had so many dollars left to pay settlements or claims. So it was a question of whose claim showed up on the adjuster's desk sooner. Unfortunately, our client was able to settle his case and get his claim paid. But what do you do in terms of due diligence, in terms of vetting insurance companies? Because there's a lot of carriers that sell malpractice insurance that no one really knows very much about.
Yeah, there are, and this is a big issue for our hospital clients as well. Not to switch gears, but when you look at the hospital client, and especially a hospital who's taken on a significant retention, right? And how do they vet the physicians who are going to be operating at the hospital? So we do the same thing. I mean, we do in Illinois, we're lucky to have 5 or 6 very, very, very strong standard market carriers that are out there. So when I look at somebody who ventures outside of those 5 or 6 carriers, I often wonder why. Why are you doing this? Why are you going to, maybe save a couple $1,000, and you're going to go with a carrier who is smaller than my company? We're a 400-person company, $85 million in revenue. Why would you go to a company who's smaller than us when you have all these other options out there? Or, at the same time, there are strong risk retention groups, and there are risk retention groups who are not strong. It's hard to get financial information a lot of times on a captive or risk retention group. As a matter of fact, we just had a very, very large risk retention group for emergency physicians just filed for bankruptcy maybe 2-3 weeks ago, domiciled in Vermont. So again, I just caution when you venture outside of the standard 5 or 6 that are here, that are established and very, very financially strong.
I think that's a great point. All right. Well, I think we're running out of time here. So how about we have some final thoughts on malpractice? Is there anything you wish doctors, dentists, other providers, or anybody else out there knew about malpractice insurance, or about, what you do that they don't know?
I don't know. What I really like to do is just kind of throw out a little advertisement. Again, not for Horton, but there's a House bill that's sitting on Governor Pritzker's desk right now that deals with prejudgment interest. And if anybody hasn't looked at it, that's in the healthcare industry, I urge you to really take a good look at it and advocate with your local government to really have the governor get rid of this bill. It really could turn the insurance industry upside down here. We're already in a very, very stressed market. Illinois has always been a tough state. Malpractice premiums are high. If this goes through, the whole system's going to change, and we're just not going to be able to put the glue back in the bottle. So I just urge you, as for your profession, really take a look at it, examine it, and really start to advocate to get this thing off the books.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. I wasn't even aware. David, any final thoughts from you?
No, I think, Mike, thank you for being a guest on our podcast. I think that it's pretty clear that physicians are going to be better served if they hire a knowledgeable broker. And
Agree.
It doesn't cost the physician any money to do it.
No.
And the advice you give is, well, it may be free, it's still great advice.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been fun. I've enjoyed talking with you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. And thank you all for joining us for the HealthLaw HotSpot. And we'll see you next time.
Use of the Roetzel HealthLaw HotSpot does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and the firm or any of its attorneys. The Roetzel HealthLaw HotSpot should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice, and you should contact an attorney in your state about any legal needs or questions you may have.